The dust from a dozen hooves hung in the air like a curtain across the crimson sunset as Nathaniel Dawson rode into the small frontier town of Promise Creek. It was 1875, and the young woman watching his arrival from the boarding house window had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Naomi Clark pressed her palms against the weathered windowsill, her breath creating a small cloud on the glass. At 22, she had traveled over 1,000 miles from Boston to this Wyoming Territory outpost to take a position as the town's new schoolteacher. The journey had been long, the stagecoach uncomfortable, but nothing compared to the ache of leaving behind everything familiar. That would be Thomas Reeves, Mrs. Holloway, the boarding house owner, said, appearing behind Naomi with a fresh stack of linens. Best horse breeder in 3 counties. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. Naomi watched as the tall man dismounted with effortless grace, his movements suggesting years in the saddle. His dark hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the land and respected its dangers. "Is he dangerous?" Naomi asked, immediately regretting the childish question. Mrs. Holloway laughed, the sound warm in the sparse room. "Only to young ladies' hearts, I suspect. Though he's never seemed interested in any of the local girls, too busy with that ranch of his." Naomi turned from the window, smoothing down her practical gray travel dress. "Well, it's of no concern to me. I'm here to teach, not to fraternize." "Of course, dear Mrs. Holloway said with a knowing smile that made Naomi's cheeks flush. "School starts Monday. You have the weekend to settle in." After Mrs. Holloway left, Naomi unpacked her modest belongings, books mostly, a few treasured photographs, and the teaching materials she'd brought from back east. Her thoughts, however, kept returning to the cowboy she'd seen from the window. There was something compelling about him, something that stirred her curiosity despite her determination to focus solely on her teaching duties. Saturday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine. Naomi decided to explore Promise Creek, hoping to familiarize herself with the town before Monday. The main street was bustling with weekend activity, ranch hands in town for supplies, families doing their shopping, and a few rough-looking men stumbling out of the saloon despite the early hour. The general store seemed like a good place to start. Naomi pushed open the door, a small bell announcing her arrival. The store was packed with goods of every description: barrels of flour and sugar, shelves of canned goods, tools, fabric, and even a small selection of books. "You must be the new schoolteacher," the storekeeper said, beaming at her from behind the counter. "I'm Harold Baxter. My boy Tommy will be in your class. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Baxter. I'm Naomi Clark." As they chatted, the bell above the door rang again. Naomi turned to see the cowboy from yesterday entering the store. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a summer storm. "Morning, Thomas," Harold called. "Got those nails you ordered?" "Appreciate it, Harold," Thomas replied, his voice deep and resonant. Harold gestured toward Naomi. "This here's Miss Clark, our new schoolteacher." Thomas Reeves removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He nodded politely. "Madam. Welcome to Promise Creek." "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," Naomi replied, surprised by the sudden flutter in her stomach. She'd met countless men in Boston, many of them educated and sophisticated, yet none had affected her quite like this rough-hewn cowboy with his direct gaze. "You settling in all right?" he asked, his eyes assessing her in a way that wasn't inappropriate but was certainly thorough. "Yes, thank you. Everyone has been very welcoming." A half smile softened his features. "Folks here are good people mostly. But if you need anything, my ranch is just north of town, the Broken R." Before Naomi could respond, the store door burst open, and a young boy of about 10 rushed in, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Reeves, Pa says your new stallion broke through the corral again." Thomas settled his hat back on his head. "Duty calls. Good day, Miss Clark." As quickly as he'd entered her orbit, he was gone, leaving Naomi with the unsettling feeling that something significant had just occurred, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. The weekend passed quickly, and Monday morning found Naomi standing before 15 curious faces in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. Children ranging from 6 to 16 filled the rough-hewn benches, their expressions varying from excitement to boredom to outright suspicion. "Good morning," she began, writing her name on the blackboard. "I'm Miss Clark, and I'll be your teacher. I've come all the way from Boston to be here with you, and I'm very excited to begin our learning journey together." A small girl in the front row raised her hand. "Is it true that in Boston, ladies wear dresses made of silk every day?" Naomi smiled. "Not every day, but for special occasions, yes." "Have you ever been on a train?" asked a boy near the back. "I have. In fact, I took the train part of the way here." "My pa says Eastern folks don't know nothing about real living," declared another boy, challenging her with his gaze. Naomi met his eyes steadily. "Then I hope you'll teach me about real living, while I teach you about mathematics and literature. We can learn from each other." The boy seemed taken aback by her response, but nodded grudgingly. By noon, Naomi had assessed her students' various abilities and begun grouping them accordingly. She was just dismissing them for lunch when the door opened, and Thomas Reeves entered, leading a reluctant teenage boy by the shoulder. "Miss Clark," he said, removing his hat. "Found this young man fishing at Crawford Creek instead of attending school. Thought I'd deliver him personally." The boy, perhaps 15, stared at the floor, his ears red with embarrassment. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," Naomi said, gesturing for the boy to take a seat. "Mr. Tucker," the boy muttered. "Tyler Tucker." "Well, Mr. Tucker, you've missed our morning lessons, but you're just in time for history after lunch. Please don't be late tomorrow." Thomas gave the boy a stern look. "Your pa works too hard for you to be wasting your education, Tyler." After Tyler shuffled to an empty bench, Thomas turned back to Naomi. "Sorry for the interruption, Miss Clark." "Not at all. I appreciate your concern for the boy's education." Thomas hesitated, then said, "I was wondering if you might allow me to escort you to the Founders' Day celebration this Saturday. As a newcomer, you might appreciate having someone explain the local traditions." The invitation caught Naomi off guard. She hadn't expected the reserved rancher to take an interest in her. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Reeves. I would like that." A genuine smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "I'll call for you at the boarding house at noon, then." After he left, Naomi found herself anticipating Saturday with unexpected eagerness. She'd come to Promise Creek to teach, not to form attachments, but there was something about Thomas Reeves that intrigued her. The rest of the week passed in a blur of lessons, getting to know her students and preparing for the celebration. By Friday, the children were too excited about the upcoming festivities to focus properly, and Naomi dismissed them early, sending them home with extra reading assignments as a gentle reminder that education continued even during celebrations. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Naomi dressed with extra care, choosing a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She just finished pinning up her hair when Mrs. Holloway knocked on her door. "There's a mighty handsome cowboy waiting downstairs for you," she said with a wink. Naomi felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I'll be right down." Thomas stood in the parlor, hat in hand, wearing a clean shirt and what appeared to be new trousers. His normally wind-tousled hair had been combed neatly, and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline that his usual stubble concealed. "Miss Clark," he said, his eyes warming as they took her in. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. You're quite presentable yourself." He offered his arm, and together they stepped out into the bright Wyoming sunshine. The main street had been transformed. Bunting hung from the storefronts. Tables laden with food lined the boardwalks, and a makeshift dance floor had been constructed in front of the town hall. Founders' Day celebrates the establishment of Promise Creek, Thomas explained as they walked. Old Man Prescott led a wagon train here in '52, liked what he saw, and decided to stay. The town grew up around his trading post. "It's wonderful that you maintain that connection to your history," Naomi said, genuinely interested. They wandered through the celebration, stopping to chat with townsfolk, many of whom were parents of Naomi's students. Thomas introduced her to people she hadn't yet met, his hand occasionally resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that sent inexplicable shivers up her spine. They were sampling Mrs. Peterson's famous apple pie when Sheriff Donovan approached, his expression grave. "Thomas, got a minute?" Thomas excused himself, stepping aside with the sheriff. Naomi couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Thomas's jaw tighten, his posture becoming rigid. When he returned, his eyes had darkened. "I'm sorry, Miss Clark, but there's been trouble at the Simmons place. Cattle rustlers, most likely. The sheriff's forming a posse, and I need to join them." Disappointment washed over her, but Naomi nodded in understanding. "Of course." "Please be careful, Mr. Reeves." He hesitated, then took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Thomas, please, and I'd like to call on you again if I may." "I'd like that. Thomas, and you may call me Naomi." A fleeting smile crossed his face before he released her hand. "I'll see you soon, Naomi." She watched him stride away, joining a group of men mounting horses at the edge of town, something twisted in her chest, a concern that surprised her with its intensity. She barely knew this man, yet the thought of him riding into danger disturbed her deeply. 3 days passed with no word from Thomas or the posse. Naomi threw herself into her teaching, but her thoughts kept straying to the rancher with the storm-gray eyes. Had he been injured? Was he safe? On the 4th day, as she was walking home from school, she spotted a rider approaching from the north, a familiar figure on a distinctive black horse. Relief flooded through her, so potent she had to stop walking for a moment to compose herself. Thomas reined in beside her, looking trail-worn and weary. A dark bruise marked his left cheekbone, and his knuckles were scraped raw. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up without thinking to touch the bruise. He caught her hand, holding it gently. "It's nothing." "We caught the rustlers, returned the Simmons cattle, that's what matters." "I was worried," she admitted, something softened in his expression. "Were you now?" "It would be a shame to lose the only person in town who's offered to explain local traditions to me," she said lightly, trying to mask the depth of her concern. He smiled, seeing through her attempt at casualness. "I promise to call on you again. I'm a man of my word." "I'm counting on that, Mr. Reeves." "Thomas," he reminded her. "Thomas," she repeated, liking the way his name felt on her lips. He released her hand reluctantly. "I need to report to the sheriff, then get some rest, but I'll come by the schoolhouse tomorrow if that's all right." "I'd like that very much." As promised, Thomas appeared at the schoolhouse the following afternoon, just as Naomi was dismissing her students. He stood in the doorway, watching as she erased the blackboard, his presence filling the small room. "I thought perhaps you might like to see something of the countryside," he said when the last child had left, "if you're not too tired from teaching." Naomi set down the eraser. "I'd love that. Let me get my things." Outside, Thomas had 2 horses waiting, his black stallion and a gentle-looking chestnut mare. "I borrowed her from Harold Baxter. He said she's steady enough for even the most inexperienced rider." "How did you know I'm not an experienced horsewoman?" Naomi asked, raising an eyebrow. Thomas's lips quirked in amusement. "Just a guess. Boston ladies aren't typically known for their riding skills." "I'll have you know I took riding lessons at Beacon Hill Park," she informed him, though the truth was she'd only had a few lessons, and those on very docile horses with an instructor holding the reins. He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The mare stood patiently as Naomi arranged her skirts and found her balance. "Ready?" Thomas asked, swinging effortlessly onto his own horse. Naomi nodded, determined not to show her nervousness. She'd come west to experience new things after all. They rode at a leisurely pace, Thomas leading them out of town and along a well-worn trail that followed a creek. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, turning the surrounding hills into a patchwork of amber and shadow. "It's beautiful," Naomi said, genuinely awed by the vastness of the land, so different from Boston. "You miss it, Boston?" Thomas asked, studying her face. Naomi considered the question. "I miss certain things, libraries, museums, the familiarity of it, but there's something about this place. A freedom that Boston doesn't have." "Freedom comes with risks," Thomas said quietly. "Out here, a mistake can cost you your life. The land doesn't forgive easily." "Is that why you stay, for the freedom?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I stay because this is where I belong. I tried the East once, Philadelphia. lasted 3 months before the buildings started to feel like they were closing in on me. What were you doing in Philadelphia? Naomi asked, curious about this glimpse into his past. My mother's family is there. After the war, they wanted me to join the family business, banking. He said the word with a hint of distaste. You fought in the war? Naomi asked softly. Thomas nodded, his expression shuddering slightly. Union cavalry, enlisted in '63 when I was 18, saw things no man should see. Naomi didn't press for details. The war had ended 10 years ago, but its shadows lingered in the lives of so many. Her own father had returned from the conflict a changed man, prone to dark moods and nightmares that had eventually driven him to an early grave. They rode in companionable silence until they reached a high meadow overlooking a valley. In the distance, a cluster of buildings nestled against the backdrop of the mountains. The Broken R, Thomas said, nodding toward the ranch. My home. It's wonderful, Naomi said, meaning it. The ranch had a settled look, as if it had grown naturally from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Thomas smiled, clearly pleased by her approval. Started with nothing but a lean-to and 3 horses, built everything else with these hands. You should be proud, Naomi said. It's quite an achievement. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink. Naomi gasped at the beauty of it. I've never seen anything like this, she admitted. Thomas watched her face, his expression soft. There's a lot of beauty out here if you know where to look. Something in his tone made her turn to meet his gaze. The way he was looking at her made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, she thought he might say more, but instead he glanced at the darkening sky. We should head back. Nightfall comes quickly out here. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the boarding house, Thomas helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for showing me your ranch, Naomi said, reluctant for the evening to end. Thank you for coming, he replied. Perhaps next time you'd like to see it up close. I'd like that very much. As the weeks passed, Thomas became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse. Sometimes he'd bring books for Naomi's students, tales of exploration and adventure that had the children clamoring for more. Other times he'd simply appear at the end of the day, offering to walk Naomi home or take her riding. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Naomi overheard whispers and saw knowing glances exchanged when she and Thomas were seen together. Mrs. Holloway was particularly delighted, dropping hints about the benefits of married life with alarming frequency. But despite the growing closeness between them, Thomas maintained a certain reserve. He was unfailingly kind and attentive, but he never attempted to court her in the traditional sense. No stolen kisses, no declarations of affection, just a steady presence that Naomi found herself increasingly dependent upon. One evening in late October, nearly 2 months after her arrival in Promise Creek, Thomas invited Naomi to dinner at the Broken R. Mrs. Holloway raised her eyebrows at the invitation, but merely advised Naomi to wear her warmest shawl, as the nights were getting colder. Thomas arrived promptly at 5, driving a well-maintained buggy. He helped Naomi up, tucking a warm blanket around her legs before climbing up beside her. My foreman's wife, Mrs. Tinsley, is quite excited to have company for dinner, Thomas said as they set off. She's been cooking all day. I hope she hasn't gone to too much trouble, Naomi said. Thomas chuckled. Sarah Tinsley considers feeding people her personal mission. She'd cook a feast for a passing stranger. The ride to the ranch took less than an hour. As they approached, Naomi could see that the main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a substantial 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch wrapped around the front. A woman emerged from the house as they pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was round and motherly, with a kind face and gray streaked brown hair. About time you got here, she called to Thomas. The roast's been done these 15 minutes. Thomas helped Naomi down from the buggy. Mrs. Tinsley, this is Miss Clark. Naomi, this is Sarah Tinsley, the best cook in the territory and the true ruler of the Broken R. Sarah Tinsley beamed at Naomi. Pleased to meet you at last, Miss Clark. This one's been talking about you non-stop since the day you arrived. Has he now? Naomi said, glancing at Thomas, who actually looked embarrassed. Don't believe everything Sarah tells you, he said, guiding Naomi toward the house. She's prone to exaggeration. Inside, the ranch house was surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with sturdy furniture arranged around it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Naomi's hands itch to explore them. "You have quite a library," she commented, scanning the titles. "My mother's influence," Thomas said. She believed in the importance of education, even out here. Dinner was served in a dining room warmed by another fireplace. The table was set with surprisingly fine china, and the food was indeed exceptional: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and vegetables from the ranch's garden. Sarah's husband, Frank Tinsley, joined them, a weathered man with laugh lines around his eyes who clearly adored his wife and respected his employer. The conversation flowed easily, covering topics from the ranch's operations to the progress of Naomi's students. After dinner, Sarah shooed the men out, insisting they go smoke their pipes on the porch while she and Naomi had women's talk. Once they were alone, Sarah poured tea and settled across from Naomi with a direct gaze. "So, you and Thomas," she said without preamble. Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We're friends, Mrs. Tinsley." "Sarah, please, and friends is good. Friends is how it should start." She studied Naomi over her teacup. "That man's been alone too long, lost his parents young, then the war, it changed him, closed him off." "He doesn't speak much about the war," Naomi said carefully. Sarah nodded. "He wouldn't. Saw terrible things, did terrible things, came back hollow-eyed and silent. Threw himself into building this ranch, working from sunup to sundown like a man running from something." Naomi thought about the quiet strength she'd observed in Thomas, the careful way he moved through the world. "He seems at peace now." "More so since you arrived," Sarah said, her eyes kind but knowing. "I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." "I know when something's different." Before Naomi could respond, the men returned, bringing with them the scent of pipe tobacco and the cool night air. Thomas glanced between the women, his expression curious. "Should I be worried about what you two have been discussing?" "Nothing that concerns you, Thomas Reeves," Sarah said, rising to clear the dishes. "Now, why don't you show Miss Clark the rest of the house while I make coffee?" Thomas offered Naomi his arm. "Would you like a tour?" "I'd love one," she said, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. He showed her through the house, the study where he kept the ranch accounts, the small room that had been his mother's sewing room, the upstairs bedrooms with their handmade quilts. Throughout the tour, Naomi was struck by how the house reflected its owner: solid, unpretentious, but with unexpected touches of refinement. They ended in a small room off the main parlor, where a piano stood against the wall. "My mother's," Thomas explained, running his fingers lightly over the keys. "She taught music in Philadelphia before she married my father and came west." "Do you play?" Naomi asked. "Poorly. She tried to teach me, but I was more interested in horses." He glanced at her. "Do you?" "A little." "All proper Boston girls are taught music, whether they have talent or not." Thomas gestured to the piano bench. "Would you play something? The piano hasn't been touched in years, but Frank keeps it tuned. Says a house should have music." Naomi sat, testing the keys. The piano was indeed well tuned. She began a simple melody, one of Chopin's preludes that she'd practiced countless times in her parents' parlor. The music filled the room, sweet and melancholy. Thomas stood beside the piano, watching her hands move across the keys, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment. "That was beautiful," he finally said, his voice low. "I'd forgotten how music can touch something inside you." The intensity of his gaze made Naomi's breath catch. There was something happening between them, something important and fragile. The moment was broken by Sarah calling that coffee was ready. As they returned to the dining room, Naomi felt as if some threshold had been approached but not yet crossed. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, but the ride back to town was quieter, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. When they reached the boarding house, Thomas helped Naomi down from the buggy, his hands strong and warm at her waist. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "It meant a lot to have you there." "Thank you for inviting me. Your home is wonderful, Thomas." He hesitated, then reached out to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, his touch feather light. "Good night, Naomi. Good night," she whispered, wondering if he could hear the quickening of her heart. As November brought colder weather to Promise Creek, life settled into a pattern. Naomi's days were filled with teaching, her evenings often spent in Thomas's company. They rode together on weekends, explored the countryside, and attended church socials side by side. Yet still, Thomas maintained that careful distance, never overstepping the bounds of propriety. Naomi found herself increasingly frustrated by his restraint. In Boston, she'd rebuffed suitors without a second thought, focused on her ambition to teach. But here, with this quiet, thoughtful man who read poetry to her students and gentled wild horses with his touch, she found herself longing for more than friendship. The opportunity to confront the situation came unexpectedly. A early winter storm blew in one Friday afternoon, forcing Naomi to dismiss her students early. As the last child hurried home through the swirling snow, Thomas appeared at the schoolhouse door, his coat white with accumulation. "I came to escort you home," he said, stamping the snow from his boots. "This storm's turning nasty." "That's very kind of you," Naomi said, gathering her books and wrapping her woolen shawl more tightly around her shoulders. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally. Thomas took Naomi's arm, guiding her through the thickening white curtain. They had barely gone 100 yards when he stopped. "This is worse than I thought," he shouted over the wind. "We'll never make it all the way to the boarding house in this. My cabin's just over the ridge." "We should wait out the storm there." Naomi hesitated. Going to a man's home unchaperoned was exactly the sort of situation she'd been raised to avoid, but the stinging snow and howling wind made the decision for her. "Lead the way," she called back. Thomas wrapped an arm around her shoulders, sheltering her as best he could as they trudged through deepening snow. By the time they reached the small cabin at the edge of town, a place Thomas kept for when ranch business required him to stay overnight, Naomi was chilled to the bone despite her heavy coat. The cabin was simple but clean, consisting of one room with a bed in the corner, a table and chairs, and a small stove. Thomas quickly lit the stove and a lamp, then helped Naomi remove her snow-covered coat. "You're freezing," he said, concern evident in his voice. He took a blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sit by the stove. I'll make coffee." Naomi sank gratefully into a chair, pulling the blanket tight. She watched as Thomas moved efficiently around the small space, putting coffee on to boil and adding wood to the stove. There was something deeply intimate about being alone with him like this, sheltered from the storm in this tiny haven. Once the coffee was ready, Thomas handed her a steaming mug, then took the chair opposite her. "I'm sorry about this. I should have checked the weather before coming to town." "It's not your fault," Naomi said, sipping the strong, hot coffee. No one expected the storm to arrive so quickly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside and the occasional crack of the fire in the stove. Naomi became acutely aware of how alone they were, how close. In the soft lamplight, Thomas's features seemed softer, more approachable. "May I ask you something?" she said suddenly. He looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Of course. Why haven't you kissed me?" The blunt question clearly caught him off guard. He set down his coffee mug, his expression unreadable. "That's quite direct, Miss Clark. We're past formalities, I think, and you haven't answered my question." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "It's not that I don't want to." "Then what is it?" He stood, moving to the window to stare out at the swirling snow. "You're educated, refined, from a good family." "I'm just a rancher with dirt under my fingernails and nightmares that wake me screaming." Naomi rose, letting the blanket fall from her shoulders as she crossed to stand beside him. "Do you think I care about any of that?" "You should," he said quietly. "You deserve better than a broken soldier playing at being a gentleman." Naomi placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Thomas, look at me." Reluctantly, he turned to face her. "I've never met anyone like you," she said softly. "You're kind and thoughtful and strong in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. You treat everyone with respect from the smallest child in my class to the oldest man in town." Thomas's expression softened, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. "Naomi, I've never been kissed," she admitted suddenly, the words spilling out before she could reconsider them. Surprise flickered across his face. "Never," she shook her head, feeling a blush creep up her neck. "There were suitors in Boston, but none I wanted to. None that I felt this way about." Thomas lifted his hand, cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness. "And how do you feel?" "Like I can't breathe properly when you're near," she whispered. "Like something inside me recognizes something in you, even though we've only known each other a short time." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been fighting this since the day I saw you, telling myself you'd go back east eventually, that I had no right to hold you here." "I'm not going anywhere," Naomi said firmly. "This is where I belong now." Thomas took her face in both hands, his expression intense. "I've never met anyone like you either, Naomi Clark. You're brave and stubborn and beautiful in ways that take my breath away." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her lips. "I've never been kissed," she said again, a tremor in her voice. The cowboy took her face and whispered, "Then I'll be first." His lips met hers, gentle at first, then with growing urgency as she responded. Naomi's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The kiss deepened, and she felt as if something long dormant within her was finally awakening. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "What took you so long?" Naomi asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Fear," he said honestly. "Fear that you'd reject me, that I wasn't good enough. Fear that if I started kissing you, I might never want to stop." And now his eyes darkened. "Now I know I was right about that last part." He kissed her again, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her closer. Naomi melted against him, her heart racing with the newness and the rightness of it all. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of whirlwind was taking hold, one that would change both their lives forever. The storm eventually passed, but something fundamental had shifted between Thomas and Naomi. In the weeks that followed, they were inseparable, their courtship the talk of Promise Creek. Thomas called on Naomi properly, taking her to dinners and socials, riding with her on Sundays after church. And yes, there were many more kisses stolen in the shadows of the schoolhouse, shared openly on her porch at the boarding house, exchanged with increasing passion during quiet moments alone. As Christmas approached, the entire town buzzed with preparations. The schoolchildren practiced carols under Naomi's direction, and a large pine tree was erected in the town square, decorated with handmade ornaments and candles. Thomas helped with the heavy lifting, always finding reasons to be wherever Naomi was. One evening, a week before Christmas, Thomas invited Naomi to join him for a special dinner at the Broken R. When he picked her up, he seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with the reins as they drove through the crisp winter air. "Is everything all right?" Naomi asked, concerned by his uncharacteristic restlessness. "Fine," he said quickly. "Just thinking about things." The ranch house glowed with warmth and light when they arrived. Thomas had clearly gone to great lengths to make the evening special. The dining table was set with the best china. Candles flickered everywhere, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the parlor, decorated with ribbons and tiny carved wooden ornaments. "This is beautiful," Naomi said, touched by the effort he'd made. Thomas helped her remove her coat, his hands lingering at her shoulders. "I wanted tonight to be special." Dinner was intimate, just the two of them, with dishes that Sarah had prepared and left warming on the stove. They talked easily about Naomi's students, the ranch, their hopes for the coming year. Yet beneath the conversation, Naomi sensed a current of anticipation, as if Thomas was building toward something important. After dinner, he led her to the parlor, where a fire blazed in the hearth. As Naomi settled on the sofa, Thomas remained standing, his expression serious. "Naomi, there's something I need to say." She looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, then seemed to come to a decision. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. I had a whole speech prepared, he said ruefully, but now that the moment's here, I can't remember a word of it. Thomas, he took a deep breath. I love you, Naomi Clark. I think I've loved you since that first day, when you stood up to Tyler Tucker in your schoolroom and offered to learn about real living from him. Tears pricked at Naomi's eyes. I love you too, Thomas. The relief and joy that spread across his face made her heart swell. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I'm not a wealthy man, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small diamond. But everything I have, everything I am, is yours if you want it. Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Reeves? Naomi whispered, her voice catching. I am, he said, his gray eyes intense with emotion. Will you be my wife, Naomi? Will you make this house a home again, fill it with music and laughter and maybe, someday, children? Tears spilled down Naomi's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, Naomi cradled his face in her hands. I never expected to find you, she said softly. When I came west, I was running away from something, a life that felt too small, too predetermined. I never imagined I'd find someone who would make me feel so, complete. Thomas turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. I was lost before you, Naomi, living but not really alive. You brought the light back. They spent the rest of the evening planning their future together, talking about a spring wedding, about Naomi continuing to teach at least until they started a family, about the improvements they wanted to make to the ranch house. As the hour grew late, Thomas reluctantly drove Naomi back to the boarding house, neither of them minding the cold with the warmth of their shared joy to sustain them. News of their engagement spread quickly through Promise Creek. The townsfolk were universally delighted. Thomas was respected, Naomi was adored, and their union seemed a perfect match. Mrs. Holloway immediately appointed herself unofficial wedding planner, while Sarah Tinsley declared she would bake the most magnificent wedding cake the territory had ever seen. The months leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and deepening love. Thomas began construction on an addition to the ranch house, a dedicated library for Naomi's growing collection of books, and a music room where the piano could be properly showcased. Naomi continued teaching, though she now rode to and from school on the gentle mare that Thomas had given her as an engagement present. Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect on the first Saturday in May, 1876. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church at the edge of Promise Creek. Naomi wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Holloway had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had been sent by her mother in Boston. Thomas stood tall and proud in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Naomi as she walked down the aisle on the arm of Sheriff Donovan, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of her father. Dearly beloved, the preacher began, his voice carrying to the back of the packed church. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas James Reeves and Naomi Elizabeth Clark in holy matrimony. As they exchanged their vows, Naomi felt as if her heart might burst with happiness. This man, this place, this life, it was everything she hadn't known she was searching for. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. Thomas, you may kiss your bride. Thomas cupped her face gently, just as he had that stormy night in his cabin. I love you, Mrs. Reeves, he whispered before claiming her lips in a kiss that had the congregation erupting in cheers and applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with dancing and feasting and toasts to the happy couple. As evening fell, Thomas led Naomi to the waiting buggy that would take them back to the Broken R, their home now together. The ranch house had been transformed in their absence. Sarah and Frank had decorated the porch with lanterns and flowers, and the bedroom was prepared with fresh linens, and more flowers scattered across the handmade quilt. Thomas carried Naomi across the threshold, setting her down gently in the center of the parlor. Welcome home, Mrs. Reeves. Naomi looked around the room that had become so familiar over the past months, seeing it now through new eyes as the place where they would build their life together. It's perfect, Thomas, He drew her into his arms, his eyes dark with promise. "You're perfect." That night, as they discovered each other in the most intimate ways, Naomi finally understood what the poets meant when they wrote about two souls becoming one. In Thomas's tender, reverent touch, she found a passion that matched her own, a love that transcended the physical and touched something profound and eternal within her. Afterward, lying in his arms as moonlight spilled through the window, Naomi traced the outline of his jaw with her fingertip. "I never imagined being this happy." Thomas caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "This is just the beginning, Naomi. We have our whole lives ahead of us. Promise me something," she said softly. "Anything. Promise me we'll never take this for granted. That we'll remember how precious it is every day." Thomas pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. "I promise. Every morning when I wake up beside you, I'll thank God for bringing you into my life." As they drifted towards sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Naomi reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a Boston schoolroom to the Wyoming frontier, from a careful, ordered existence to the wild, unpredictable adventure of loving Thomas Reeves. It hadn't been the life she'd planned, but it was infinitely better than anything she could have imagined. In the years that followed, Promise Creek watched the Reeves family grow and flourish. Naomi continued teaching until their first child was born, a daughter they named Eleanor Sarah, after both their mothers. 2 years later, a son joined the family, James Thomas, a sturdy boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's curious nature. And finally, 3 years after that, another daughter, Grace Marie, the image of Naomi with the same determined spirit that had brought her mother west. The Broken R prospered under Thomas's careful management, becoming one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Naomi established a small library in town, using books donated by her family in Boston and purchased with proceeds from cattle sales. Together, they built a legacy of love, hard work, and community that rippled outward, touching countless lives. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Naomi with a trip to Boston to visit her family. It was the first time he'd been east since before the war, and his initial discomfort in the crowded city was evident. But seeing Naomi reconnect with her parents and siblings, watching her show their children the places of her childhood, made any discomfort worthwhile. "Thank you for this," Naomi said as they walked through Boston Common, their children running ahead. "I know how difficult it is for you to be here." Thomas squeezed her hand. "Seeing you happy is worth a little discomfort. Besides, your father's stories about your childhood antics have been most enlightening." Naomi laughed, leaning into his side. "Just wait until we get home. Sarah has a whole collection of tales about your youthful misadventures that I've been saving for the right moment." They stayed in Boston for 3 weeks before the pull of home became too strong to resist. As the train carried them west again, Naomi watched the landscape change from crowded settlements to vast, open spaces, her heart lightening with each mile. "It's strange," she said to Thomas as they crossed into Wyoming territory. "I thought I might feel torn being back in Boston. But all I felt was gratitude for where I came from and certainty about where I belong." Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as their children dozed across from them. "And where is that, Mrs. Reeves?" Naomi smiled up at him, her heart full. "Wherever you are, Thomas. That's home." As the years passed, Promise Creek grew from a frontier outpost to a thriving town. The railroad came through in 1885, bringing new people and opportunities. Thomas served as mayor for 2 terms, using his position to ensure the town developed without losing its character. Naomi's library expanded into a proper schoolhouse, where she eventually returned to teaching once the children were older. Their children grew strong and capable in the freedom of ranch life. Eleanor showed a talent for horses that rivaled her father's, while James displayed a sharp mind for business that helped expand the ranch's operations. Little Grace, the youngest, combined her mother's love of books with her father's connection to the land, eventually documenting the history and natural wonders of the territory in writings that would one day be published back east. Through it all, the good years and the lean ones, The joys and the sorrows that inevitably touch every life Thomas and Naomi's love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. Each night, no matter how busy or tired they were, they took time to be alone together, to reconnect and remind each other of the promise they'd made on their wedding night. On their 30th anniversary, with their children grown and starting families of their own, Thomas took Naomi back to the small cabin where they'd sheltered from the storm all those years ago, where he'd first kissed her. The cabin had been maintained over the years, but remained essentially unchanged, a simple, one-room haven that held the beginning of their story. "I can't believe it's been 30 years, Naomi said, looking around the familiar space. At 52, she was still beautiful, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her blue eyes as bright and intelligent as ever. Thomas, his own hair more gray than brown now, but his tall figure still straight and strong, wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Best 30 years of my life." Naomi leaned back against him, savoring the solid strength that had been her constant through 3 decades of marriage. "Do you remember what I told you that night? During the storm?" "Every word," Thomas murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "I've never been kissed, you said." "And I told you, then I'll be first," Naomi finished, turning in his arms to face him. "You were my first kiss, Thomas Reeves, my first love, my only love." Thomas cupped her face just as he had that night, his weathered hands gentle against her skin. "And you were the first person to truly see me, Naomi. The first to make me believe I deserved happiness after the war, the first and only woman I will ever love." As their lips met in a kiss that held 30 years of shared history, yet still sparked with the same passion as their first, Naomi knew that some stories don't end with "happily ever after." The best ones, the truest ones, continue writing themselves day after day, year after year through challenge and triumph, sorrow and joy, always returning to the love that started it all. Outside the cabin window, Promise Creek spread out below them, the town they'd helped build, the community that had watched their love story unfold. Beyond it lay the broken R, where their children and grandchildren now gathered, carrying forward the legacy they'd created together. And in that moment, with Thomas's arms around her and their lifetime of memories surrounding them, Naomi was certain of one thing, that the scared but determined young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach all those years ago could never have imagined the richness of the life that awaited her. A life that began with a storm, a confession, and a cowboy who whispered, "Then I'll be first."